The Pagan's Cup. Chapter 1. Modern Arcadia. By Fergus Hume. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne. Certain portions of England yet remain undiscovered by Americans and uncivilized by railways. Colster village, above King's Meadows, in a county which need not be named, is one of these unknown spots. No doubt before long the bicycle and the motor car will enliven its somnolent neighborhood, but at present it is free from the summer jaunts of tourists. With this neglect the Colster folk profess themselves satisfied. They have no wish to come into contact with the busy world. This prejudice against intrusion dates from medieval times, when strangers rarely came to the village with peaceful intentions. Even now a chance comer is looked upon with suspicion. Mr. Richard Pratt said something of this sort to the vicar during a morning ramble, some 6 weeks after he had taken up his residence in the Nun's House. With the parson and the gentry of the parish, Mr. Pratt agreed very well, his respectability having been vouched for by Mrs. Gabriel, the lady of the manor. But the villagers still held aloof, although the newcomer did his best to overcome their churlish doubts. They did not credit his story that he had settled in Colster to pass his remaining years in peace, and even the money he scattered so freely could not buy their loyalty. Pratt had never met with such people before. In most countries an open purse invites an open heart, but the Colster villagers were above mammon worship. Such an experience was refreshing to Pratt, and introduced him to a new type of humanity. "The first place I ever struck in which the dollar is not all powerful," he said, with his Yankee twang and pleasant laugh. "We are not sufficiently educated in that respect," replied Mr. Tempest in his simple way. "For my part, I am not ill pleased that my parishioners should refuse to worship the golden calf." "There's no calf about me, I guess," said Pratt, grimly, "and very little gold. I don't say I haven't a decent income, but as to being a millionaire, no, sir." "In the kingdom of the blind the one-eyed is king, Mr. Pratt. You are a millionaire in this poor place, but I fear you find it dull." "Why no, vicar, I'm glad to be out of the buzz. The world's made up of nerves and machinery nowadays. At 52 years of age I can't stand the racket. This Sleepy Hollow's good enough for me to stay in, until I peg out. Guess I'll buy an allotment in that graveyard of yours." "Hollow," said the vicar, smiling, "and our earthly dwelling-place is set up on a hill. Mr. Pratt, I suspect you have Irish blood in your veins." Pratt laughed, and being to a large extent devoid of humour, explained earnestly that he had used the word figuratively. "Washington Irving, Rip Van Winkle," he explained, nodding, whereat the vicar smiled again. The situation of Colster was striking and strange. A green-clothed promontory extended abruptly from the high tableland into King's Meadow. To right and left chalky cliffs of considerable height flared away for miles, forming a buttress to the moors above and walls to the plain below. In prehistoric ages the ocean waves had beaten against these cliffs, but, gradually receding, had left dry the miles upon miles of fertile lands now called King's Meadows. An appanage of the crown, they had been called so from the days of William the Conqueror. From where they stood, the vicar and his friend had a bird's-eye view of this desirable land, unrolled like a map under the bright June sky. League after league of cornfields stretched away to the clear, shining line of ocean, and amidst the ripening grain appeared red-roofed villages, clumps of trees, the straight lines of dusty white roads, and the winding, glittering serpent of the river. And as a background to this smiling plenty, if so Irish an expression can be permitted, was the blue expanse of the Channel dotted with the white sails of merchantmen. A small wood of ancient oaks shut off the purple-clad moor from the spur upon which Colster was built. On the verge of this, yet encircled by trees, stood the village church, a crusading chapel, dedicated to St. Gabriel the Messenger. Thence the ground fell away gradually, and spread out into a broad neck of land, down the centre of which ran a road leading from chapel to village. On either side of this, amidst oaks and elms and sycamores, were the houses of the gentry. From where they ended the promontory rose into 2 rounded hills, with a slight depression between. On the one to the left the village was built, its houses cramped within a tumble-down wall dating from the days when it was needed as a defence. The other hill was surmounted by a well-preserved castle, the keep of which with its flag could be seen above the oak woods. This was inhabited by Mrs. Gabriel, the sole representative of the feudal lords of Colchester. Yet she was only the childless widow of the last baron, and had none of the fierce Gabriel blood in her veins. The once powerful and prolific family was extinct. From castle and village, steps led down into the depression between the two hills. Down this continued the chapel road, sloping gradually with many windings to the plains below. The whole place had the look of some Rhenish robber hold. And if tradition was to be trusted, the Gabriel lords had dwelt like eagles in their eyrie, swooping down at intervals to harry and plunder, burn and slay the peaceful folk of the plains. A turbulent and aggressive race, the Gabriels. It had defied king and priest, and parliament and people. Time alone had ever conquered it. A survival of the Middle Ages, said Mr. Tempest, pointing out these things to his companion. It was needful that the Gabriel barons should build strong defences. They were fierce and bloodthirsty, defiant of law and order. For many centuries they were a scourge to the inhabitants of the plains. These often complained to the king, and several times the place was besieged, but without result. The Gabriels kept their hold of it. The only thing they ever lost was their title. A bill of attainder was passed against them in the time of the second George. After that they became less lions than foxes. Just so, said Mr. Pratt. This place couldn't do much against artillery, I guess. And even in the bow and arrow days, a strong force coming over the moor and down the spur. That was often tried, interrupted Tempest, quickly. But the attempts always failed. In the days of Henry II, Aylmer Gabriel beat back an overwhelming force, and then erected the chapel as a thanksgiving. The Archangel Gabriel was the patron saint of the family, and the chapel is dedicated to him. He couldn't keep the family from dying out, however, said Pratt, as they moved towards the village. No, with the late John Gabriel the family became extinct. But I dare say Mrs. Gabriel will arrange that her adopted son succeeds. He can take the name and the coat of arms. I should be very pleased to see that, added the vicar, half to himself. Leo is a good fellow, and would make an excellent landlord. The eyes of the American flashed when the name was mentioned, but he made only a careless comment. Leo Haverly, he said, after a pause. He's a right smart young chap, sure. Who is he? The son of Mrs. Gabriel's brother. She was a Miss Haverly, you know. I believe her brother was somewhat dissipated, and died abroad. The boy arrived here when he was 3 years of age, and Mrs. Gabriel adopted him. He will be her heir. Is there anyone to object? Asked Pratt, eagerly. The vicar shook his head. The Gabriels are absolutely extinct. Failing Leo, the estates would lapse to the crown. In the old days they would have been seized by the king in any case, as the sovereigns were always anxious to hold this point of vantage which dominated the lands below. But we live in such law-abiding times that Mrs. Gabriel, although not of the blood of the family, can leave the estates to whomsoever she will. I understand that she has quite decided Leo shall inherit and take the name, also the coat of arms. She doesn't strike me as over fond of the boy, said Pratt, as they climbed the crooked street. Rather a hard woman, I should say. Mrs. Gabriel has a particularly high moral standard, replied the vicar, evasively, and she wishes all to attain to it. Leo, he hesitated. He's no worse than a boy ought to be, said the American, cheerily. Your young saint makes an old sinner. That's so, vicar. Mr. Tempest laughed outright. I fear there is small chance of Leo becoming a saint, either young or old, he said, though he is a good lad in many ways. Wild, I admit, but his heart is in the right place. Pratt smiled to himself. He knew that Leo was in love with Sybil, the daughter of this prosy old archaeologist. Simple as Mr. Tempest was, he could not be blind to the possibility of his daughter making such an excellent match. Oh, yes, laughed Pratt, knowingly. I'm sure his heart is in the right place. But by this time the vicar was on his hobby horse, and did not gauge the significance of the speech. Here, he said, waving his hand towards the 4 sides of the square in which they stood, the Romans built a camp. It crowned this hill, and was garrisoned by the 10th Legion to overawe the turbulent tribes swarming on the plains below. In fact, this town is built within the camp, as the name shows. "How does it show that?" asked Pratt, more to keep the vicar talking than because he cared. "The name, man, the name. It's properly Colster, but by usage has been shortened to Colster. Colne comes from the Latin colonia, a colony, and castor or cester is derived from castra, a camp. Colncester therefore means the camp colony, which proves that the original builders of this town erected their dwellings within the circumvallation of the great original castra of Claudian. If you will come with me, Mr. Pratt, I will show you the remains of this great work." "I have seen it several times before," replied Pratt, rather bored by this archaeological disquisition. "I know every inch of this place. It doesn't take an American centuries to get round, and 6 weeks of walking have fixed me up in your local geography. But there's the chapel, vicar. We might walk up there. I'd like to hear a few remarks on the subject of the chapel. Interesting. Oh, I guess so." "Certainly, certainly," said Tempest absently. "Let us walk. Walk." And he strolled away with his hands in his tail coat pockets, looking something like an elderly jackdaw. Indeed the churchman, with his lean oval face, his large spectacles, and the fluttering black garments on his thin figure, very much resembled a bird. He was scholarly, well bred and gentle, but wholly unworldly. Since his wife had died 7 years before, Sibyl had taken charge of the house. Harold Ralston, the energetic curate, looked after the parish. But for these two, both clerical and domestic affairs would have been neglected, so immersed was Mr. Tempest in his dry-as-dust explorations. Many people said openly that the vicar was past his work and should be pensioned off. Mrs. Gabriel, a capable and managing woman, had once hinted as much to him. But the usually placid parson had flown into such a rage that she had hastily withdrawn herself and her suggestion. There is nothing more terrible than the rebellion of a sheep. Mrs. Gabriel recalled this remark of Balzac's when Tempest, proving himself worthy of his name, swept her in wrath from his study. Pratt was quite another specimen of humanity. A neat, dapper, suave little man, undersized yet perfectly proportioned. He had black hair, black eyes, and a clean-shaven face, which constantly wore an expression of imperturbable good humour. His dress was too neat for the country. A blue serge suit, white spats on brown boots, a Panama hat, gloves, and, what he was never without, a smoothly rolled umbrella. Spick and span he might have stepped out of a glass case, and this was his invariable appearance. No one ever saw Pratt unshaven or untidy. He had been everywhere, had seen everything, and was a most engaging companion, never out of temper and never bored. But for all his smiling ways the villagers held aloof from him. Wishing to break down their barrier of prejudice, the sharp little American had attached himself to the vicar during the good man's usual morning walk. He thought that such a sight might dispose the villagers to relent. "I shall not vary my usual walk," remarked Mr. Tempest, positively. "We will stroll through the village, return to the chapel, and then, Mr. Pratt, I hope you will lunch with me." "Delighted, if it will not put Miss Sibyl out." "No, no. My wife is always prepared for chance visitors," answered the vicar, quite oblivious to the fact that the late Mrs. Tempest was resting in the churchyard. "Ha, this is Mrs. Geel. How do you do, Mrs. Geel?" Mrs. Geel was in excellent health, and said so with a curtsy. A dumpy, rosy-faced woman was Mrs. Geel, with a pair of extremely wicked black eyes, which snapped fire when she was angered. She had a temper, but rarely displayed it, for it suited her better to gain her ends by craft rather than force. 15 years ago she had appeared from nowhere, to settle as a midwife in Colster. Contrary to their usual fashion, the villagers had taken her to their bosoms. This was owing to the clever way Mrs. Geel had of managing them, and to her knowledge of herbs. She had cured many sick people whom the doctor had given up, and consequently was not looked upon with favour by Dr. James, who had succeeded to the family practice. But even he could not be angry at rosy, laughing Mrs. Geel. "Though I don't like her," confessed Dr. James. "The devil looks out of her eyes. Dangerous woman, very dangerous." Pratt had no chance of proving this remark of the doctor's to be true, for Mrs. Geel never looked at him. She kept her wicked eyes on the kindly victor and smiled constantly, punctuating such smiles with an occasional curtsy. "Pearl is not with you?" said Mr. Tempest. "No, bless her poor heart!" cried Mrs. Geel. "She is up at the chapel. Her favourite place is the chapel, as your reverence knows." She might have a worse place to haunt, Mrs. Gill. Poor soul! Poor, mad, innocent child!" "Do you call 18 years of age childish, Mr. Tempest?" asked the woman. "No, no. I speak of her mind, her poor weak mind. She is still a child. I beg of you to look after her, Mrs. Gill. We must make her path as pleasant as we may." "Then I beg your reverence will tell that Barker to leave her alone." "Barker? Barker? Ah, yes, the sexton. Of course. Worthy man." Mrs. Gill sniffed. "He won't let her stay in the chapel," she said. "Tut, tut. This must be seen to. Poor Pearl is God's child, Mrs. Gill, so she has a right to rest in his house. Yes, yes, I'll see to it. Good day, Mrs. Gill." The woman dropped a curtsy, and for the first time shot a glance at Pratt, who smiled blandly. A nervous expression crossed her face as she caught his eye. The next moment she drew herself up and passed on, crossing herself. Pratt looked after her, still smiling, then hurried to rejoin the vicar, who began to explain in his usual wandering way. "A good woman, Mrs. Gill. A good woman," he said. "For some years she has had charge of Pearl Dairy, whom she rescued from her cruel father." "Is that the insane girl?" said Pratt, idly. "Do not talk of one so afflicted in that way, Mr. Pratt. Pearl may not be quite right in her head, but she is sane enough to conduct herself properly. If the fact that she is not all herself reached Portfront, the principal town of the county, it is possible that the authorities might wish to shut her up, and that would be the death of Pearl. No, no," said the good vicar. "Let her have a fair share of God's beautiful earth, and live to a happy old age. In this quiet place we can afford one natural." "Like the village idiot we read about in Scotch tales," said Pratt. "Just so, Mr. Pratt. In Waverley there is such a one. Pearl Dairy is quite harmless, and really has a beautiful nature. Mrs. Gill is much to be commended for her charity." "She looks a charitable woman," said the American, but whether he meant this ironically or not it is hard to say. The women of Colchester were mostly lace workers, and toiled at this fairy-like craft while their husbands worked in the fields below. During 3 seasons the mountain men, as they might be called, ploughed the meadowland, sowed the corn, and helped to reap and harvest it. In the winter they returned to live on their earnings and take a holiday. But the women worked all the year through, and Colchester lace was famous. As the vicar and Pratt walked down the street, at the door of every house sat a woman with her pillow and pins, dexterously making the filmy fabric which was destined to adorn the dress of many a London beauty. They were mostly serious looking, and some even grim, but all had a smile for the vicar, although they pursed their lips when they saw the good-natured face of Mr. Pratt. Most unaccountable this dislike they had for the American. He was rather annoyed by his pronounced unpopularity. "I must really do something to make them like me," he said, much vexed. "Tut, tut," replied the vicar. "Liking will come in good time, Mr. Pratt. It takes some years for them to fancy a stranger. I was an object of distrust to them for quite 3. Now they are devoted to me." "And have you been here long?" "About 40 years," said Tempest. "I have buried many and christened most. We have no Methodists in Colchester, Mr. Pratt. Every one comes to church and worships according to the rites of the Anglican communion, as is fit and proper." "I suppose you are a prosperous community on the whole?" "So, so. Nothing to complain of. The lace made here by these clever fingers sells well in London and even abroad. Then the men earn a fair wage in King's Meadows. Mrs. Gabriel looks after the few poor we have amongst us. On the whole we have much to be thankful for, Mr. Pratt." Thus talking, the good vicar led his companion round by the mouldering walls, where they could look down to the plains. After a glance they re-entered the town, and walked through the cobbled stoned streets, between the quaint high-roofed houses. Everywhere the vicar was greeted, and Pratt frowned upon. He was quite glad when they descended from the village through the old gate, and after walking along the Neck, which was the fashionable part of Colchester, began to climb up towards the chapel. "A most delightful spot," said Pratt, politely, "but I guess the folk don't cotton to me. I must make them freeze on somehow." End of The Pagan's Cup, Chapter 1, A Modern Arcadia, by Fergus Hume.